Tim Duncan is one of the greatest players of all time. Not many people would put him in their top 10 of greatest players ever because of his nickname, the Big Fundamental, suggests that he's a boring player to watch. Meanwhile, when you look at guys like LeBron James, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and Stephen Curry, they have styles that you'd want to mimic. On the other hand, Duncan's game tends to be slow and uninspiring. But Duncan is the guy who will slowly and methodically eat his way through your team by relying on the fundamental parts of the game instead of jaw-dropping plays. Behind all those bank shots, hooks, and footwork is a killer who won 5 NBA championships and garnered numerous All-Star and All-NBA honors. That's why he's considered the greatest power forward ever. So, how did Tim Duncan become one of the greatest players of all time? We'll get into that and more. But before we get into it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching one of the best new basketball channels on YouTube, Swish Archives. It's the 2014 playoffs, and the San Antonio Spurs are in the middle of an inspired playoff run that got them all the way to the finals. This 2014 Spurs team is widely considered the most unselfish team of all time because players were zipping the ball around, finding open shots, and relying on a balanced offense. But the guy who kept the team together was a 38-year-old big man named Tim Duncan. This team went on to defeat a much younger and more athletic Miami Heat team in 5 games during the 2014 NBA Finals. And while the younger Kawhi Leonard went on to win Finals MVP, the 38-year-old Duncan was the best big man in that series. At his age, he averaged 15.4 points and 10 rebounds during the Finals. Meanwhile, Miami's Chris Bosh, almost 10 years younger than Timmy, averaged 14 points and 5 rebounds. A lot of NBA players have won championships at 38 years old. It's not uncommon for an old-timer to stay in the NBA way past his prime and still act as a leader, a locker room presence for his team. In Duncan's case, he wasn't just playing at an all-star level at 38 years old, but was winning his 5th NBA championship. The last time anyone saw a big man playing at a high level and winning titles at 38 was when Kareem was still considered the greatest of all time. In Duncan's case, however, he won that title at that age against LeBron James, arguably the greatest player of all time. He played spoiler to LeBron's chance at a three-peat. At that point, there were no longer any doubts about where Duncan was on the list of greatest power forwards ever. He was right at the top. But what made Timmy special was his consistency throughout his long and storied NBA career. You see, a lot of guys go through transition phases through different stages in their careers, while hopping from one team to another. Duncan, however, was the same old player since he first started playing for the Spurs. He was a master of the fundamentals from day one. His journey to the top of the NBA started in 1997. Duncan had just completed one of the greatest senior seasons of all time. He averaged 20.8 points, 14.7 rebounds, and 3.3 blocks for Wake Forest. Truth be told, he could have left for the NBA a year or 2 before. He was ready for the big leagues as early as his sophomore year. But Duncan made a promise to his mother to get his college degree before making it to the NBA. That's why he was already a polished big man, ready for the NBA grind as he finished his run with Wake Forest. And there was no doubt he was the top overall pick in 1997, taken by the San Antonio Spurs. When Duncan got to the Spurs, this team was anything but a winning organization. They had one of the worst records in the league a season ago because their franchise player, David Robinson, got injured. Meanwhile, Greg Popovich was still making a name for himself as one of the best coaches in the league. But no one thought this Spurs team was going to be dangerous enough to win a championship sooner than later. Duncan, however, started dominating the game the moment he first stepped on an NBA court. While he played center throughout most of his collegiate career, he moved down to power forward in the NBA because of Robinson. The 7'1" giant was the one patrolling the paint as the Spurs starting center. It turned out he was a natural fit for the power forward position during an era when size mattered more than skill and speed. Duncan at power forward gave the Spur a fearsome twin tower combination that everyone in the league feared. And because Robinson was already old and injury-prone back then, Duncan quickly rose as the team's best player as a rookie. By the time he reached his second season in the league, Duncan had already risen to championship status, leading the Spurs to the 1999 championship as the team's newest franchise superstar. That was the beginning of arguably the longest dynasty in NBA history, and the Spurs built an entire system and culture around Duncan's ability. At that time, fans were looking for the next Michael Jordan. They wanted a player who could inspire them with flashy moves, insane dunks, and high-scoring performances. Guys like Kobe Bryant, Allen Iverson, Vince Carter, and Tracy McGrady were stepping up to the plate to take on the challenge of becoming the next league icon. Meanwhile, Duncan was in the background, quietly operating without making a fuss. He was winning games, putting up more than 20 points and 10 rebounds, and helping the Spurs contend for a championship every season. The Los Angeles Lakers, led by Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant, dominated the Western Conference from 2000 to 2004. However, if there was one team they were always afraid of in the playoffs, it was the San Antonio Spurs. Duncan was arguably the biggest reason why. Shaq, who rarely compliments fellow big men, played against the best power forwards and centers during the 90s and 2000s. He went up against names like Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, Dikembe Mutombo, rest in peace, David Robinson, Kevin Garnett, and Yao Ming. But the one big man he admittedly could never break was Duncan. Sure, Timmy was a lot smaller than Shaq, but his focus, composure, and deadly fundamental game struck fear into the heart of the most dominant center of all time. Shaq respected Duncan so much that he started calling him the Big Fundamental, a nickname that stuck with him until the end of his career. Duncan simply did the things that power forwards or centers are supposed to do, but he did them perfectly. On the low post, he uses his footwork and understanding of angles to get enough space for a turnaround jumper, a hook shot, or simply a quick spin or drop step to the basket. But the most important part of his game was the mid-range bank shot. Duncan was arguably more dangerous from the high post than from the low post. His go-to move from the high block was his mid-range jumper from the face-up game. When he caught the ball anywhere between 10 to 17 feet, he had his defender at the palm of his hand. If he had enough space, he would shoot a jumper. But if defenders were afraid of his jump shot, he could drive to the basket and finish strong. Still, even if defenders took away all his options, Duncan's mastery of the bank shot was on another level. The beauty of Timmy's bank shot was that he knew that he could always go to the bank when the defender covered him well enough to prevent him from seeing the basket. The glass is much bigger than the basket, making it an easier target that's difficult for defenders to cover. So when he had the option of using the bank, Duncan almost always used it, and no one weaponized it as much as he did. But he was also equally dangerous on the defensive end because he mastered the fundamentals of defense as well. Duncan was never the most athletic big man. He wasn't known for his vertical leap or imposing physique. Instead, he simply knew how to use his 6'11" frame and 7'5" wingspan to block shots or cover the rim. He also had a subtle way of bending the defensive rules in a fundamental way. Because he was never an imposing figure on the court, he had his own ways of defending bigger and stronger guys down low. According to DeMarcus Cousins, who was in his prime when Duncan was old, Timmy had an old guy way of defending him in a dirty way by pulling down on his jersey or putting his arms over his defender's shoulder when contesting shots so that the scorer doesn't get off the floor high enough. He did the same thing to prime Shaquille O'Neal, and he surely did the same to younger centers like Cousins. That was why he holds the record for most all-defensive team selections, even though he never won a Defensive Player of the Year award his entire career. His mastery of the game's fundamentals and the geometry behind the bank shot turned him into one of the most elite players during his prime years. By 2002, he was already an MVP. In 2003, he won back-to-back MVP awards and became one of the rare instances where the MVP won the NBA championship in the same year. And on his way to the 2003 championship, he and the Spurs knocked out the Lakers from the playoffs. who were the 3-time defending champs. While Duncan never won consecutive championships in his career, he was a symbol of consistency because he and his Spurs were almost always in the position to become underrated contenders. In 2005, he won his 3rd championship, joining Shaq and Kobe as one of the only few stars in the league who had 3 rings. But in 2007, he won his 4th championship, marking his name in the record books as a true winner. But as Duncan got older, the Spurs learned to rely more on younger players like Tony Parker and a host of different role players who could contribute at any given moment. Though his shot attempts and minutes decreased, he never had to adjust his game. From day one, Duncan already had what you'd call old man game, a style that ages well in the league because you can rely on it as you get older. So while Duncan was losing speed, quickness, and explosiveness, his mastery of the fundamentals got him far enough that the Spurs were still dark horse contenders during the early 2010s. He was mostly coasting during the regular season because the Spurs were built in a way that allowed role players to flourish and contribute during the regular season to reduce the load on the star players. But when it was playoff time, it was winning time for the Oldtimer. After 6 years of not making the finals, Duncan returned to the championship series in 2013 to square off against the Miami Heat. It was a heated battle that almost went to the Spurs side if it weren't for a Ray Allen three-pointer in Game 6.
Basket. James catches, puts up a 3. Won't go. Rebound Bosh. Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang! Tie game with 5 seconds remaining.
While the Spurs lost that series, Duncan was dominant as a 37-year-old big man. He averaged around 19 points and 12 rebounds the entire series. Everyone thought the Spurs already had their last hurrah in 2013, but they were stronger and hungrier during the 2013-14 season. By the time the 2014 playoffs started, the Spurs were seemingly unbeatable on their way to the finals when Duncan won his 5th and final NBA championship at 38 years old. In most cases, star players don't play at 38 anymore because they're already retired 2 or 3 years ago. Or even if they reach 38 in the NBA, they're liabilities that can't score or defend. In fact, David Robinson retired at 37 but was more of a defensive presence at that point in his career. On the other hand, Duncan, at 38, was still going strong. From 1999 to 2014, a lot of star players and powerhouse teams entered and disappeared, but Duncan and the Spurs remained the only constants since then. A lot of it had to do with how the Spurs front office handled the organization and the roster, but it also had a lot to do with Duncan's mastery of the fundamentals. After all, if you can score, defend, or affect the game in any way without being the strongest and fastest player on the floor, you're bound to have a long and fruitful NBA career. As Tim Duncan's career reached its deeper ends, he was steadily facing the effects of mortality. At 39 years old, he was still effective. He made his final All-Star appearance in 2015 and had a solid performance in the first-round loss to the Los Angeles Clippers in the playoffs. But injuries and wear and tear had caught up to him by the time he was 40. During the 2015-16 season, Duncan was clearly a shell of his former self. While he could still put up good numbers from time to time, there was only so much this old man could do at his age. The younger, fresher, and more athletic Oklahoma City Thunder ran him through the ground during the 2016 playoffs, finally making him realize that Father Time had already caught up to him. Not long after the Thunder defeated the Spurs in the second round of the 2016 playoffs, Tim Duncan announced his retirement from the NBA. Unlike Kobe Bryant, who also retired in 2016, Duncan didn't announce his intentions to retire earlier because he didn't want his final season in the league to be about him and a potential farewell tour. Instead, he just continued working hard until he realized he could no longer play past 40 years old. The big fundamental was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2020. But even before he became immortalized as a Hall of Famer, everyone in the basketball community already agreed on one thing, that Tim Duncan was the greatest power forward to ever play the game. And when guys like Charles Barkley and Shaquille O'Neal say Duncan's the best to ever play his position, you know it's true. So what do you think? Is Tim Duncan really the greatest power forward of all time? Or do you have someone else in mind? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.